The boundaries which divide life from death are best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where one ends and where the other begins? Edgar Allan Poe. A deck that caught my eye a few years back was something known as the DC Whip. It was a Sultai deck that wanted to fill the graveyard and reanimate them using Whip of Erebos, while valuing off of Sidisi, Brute Tyrant. Though a simple deck, around the same time a card got banned in the modern format, that being Birthing Pod. I had never seen such a card like this, where the deck was built around wanting to have specific CMC creatures, and often for just one or two offs. All Birthing Pod decks had the same theme though, strong ETBs and other effects that could outvalue other decks from just a few activations of Birthing Pod. Then an idea popped into my head. What would happen if the two were mixed? And so was created the deck that I would like to talk about today. With Tasigur the Golden Fang leading as our commander, let's talk about a deck I like to call the Golden Whip and Pod. To start, with us playing Birthing Pod and other similar effects, we will need to build our deck in a very specific manner. That being, we need a heavy creature base that grows in incremental CMC value. With this, we will need a large CMC base of creatures with low mana cost around 1 to 3. We then want another good pool of creatures of adequate size with mana cost around 4 to 6. Then a small pool of creatures with CMCs that are 7 plus mana. We do this so that we can reliably have targets to find in the deck when we are searching, as we are able to quickly deploy and sacrifice small mana cost creatures faster than we potentially can for larger mana cost creatures. We don't just want vanilla creatures though. We want almost all our creatures to have some effect whenever they enter or leave the battlefield. Essentially, what we're trying to do is climb in incremental value from creature to creature as we fill our graveyard, which feeds into our next strategy. The second part of our strategy is self-mill and recursion. This is especially held close by Tasigur's ability, which mills us for 2 cards and allows an opponent to bring a non-land card from our graveyard back to our hand. We have many different forms of self-mill, however the best of these more than likely comes from dredge effects. Dredge allows us to opt to bring back a creature from our graveyard with dredge rather than draw a card. Should we opt to do this, there is a number associated with the dredge, which is an indicator of the number of cards we will need to mill if taking this option. This could turn into a huge card advantage as we are utilizing the graveyard quite hard as a resource. Easily, 1 card draw can turn into 3 to 6 cards in our graveyard. Though we have all these different types of self-mill, we need to take advantage of it, and we could do so in a few different ways. To go back to the title, Whip of Erebos is one of the means that we can use to bring back the creatures that were sent to the graveyard. This card is quite good for a few reasons. 1. It brings the creatures to the battlefield rather than our hand. 2. It gives these creatures haste and lifelink to make our strategy more aggressive and stable. And 3. It pairs quite well with us sacrificing creatures to Birthing Pod in our self-mill strategy. Though Whip isn't just our only option, as green, black, and blue have forms of recursion that we can take advantage of. Black primarily for creatures, blue for our instants and sorceries, and green for whatever we can find. Finally, with us wanting strong ETB triggers for our strategies, we can delve into many different options. From token generation to permanent stilling, there are a multitude of options to select at any given moment, which allows us to be quite flexible in our strategy. Our line of play isn't straightforward, which can be difficult for our opponents to predict. With this, opponents may opt to destroy the wrong items that may be hindering them, allowing for our strategy to continue without much burden. Though we have a lot of upsides and solid strategies, the deck comes with a few downsides. One of the most prominent being that we have limited interaction. Our instant speed slot is quite low, but effective in the measures that it needs to be. Should we blow through our instants, we do have measures of bringing them back with the recursion that we can be found on both green and blue. But this is not to say that we don't have to be careful and think about resource management, as we'll need to focus on key lines of play to slow our opponents down and keep our strategy safe. The next downside to the deck is how fragile the strategies that we run can be. Both Whip of Erebos and Birthing Pod can easily be destroyed, and though we have means of recurring them, we shouldn't rely on these types of effects as they are limited in usage. Next, self-mill runs into the situation of graveyard hate. Many decks will have forms of this, and we need to be careful to play around them, or one of our strategies will be completely nullified. We do run specific counterspells such as Stifle and Disallow to get around these types of effects, as if we can stop a trigger of something like Bajuka Bog, then we will be in a much better position overall. As we have a creature-focused deck, there are many different ones that can be talked about. However, we will only speak about Muldrotha the Gravetide, Prime Speaker Yennefer, and Agent of Treachery. Muldrotha the Gravetide is one of the best creatures in the deck, so long as we're able to keep him safe. With his ability, we're able to play one of each type of permanent from our graveyard. This is a fantastic recursion tool that will overload us with value and can easily push us over the finish line with strong ETB triggers and other effects from other permanents. Yennefer Prime Speaker is another form of Birthing Pod, but has a few of its own upsides. With it being a creature, we are able to not only use our green recursion, but also our black recursion. These types of cards are more than likely going to receive some hate, but should we be able to reliably continue to bring them back, then our opponents will more than likely overexpend their resources, while we are just recycling our effects. Agent of Treachery more than likely has our best ETB trigger in the deck. With it, we're able to steal any permanent on the battlefield, lands included. This is quite good for a few reasons, as it steals threats from our opponents that they were trying to utilize, can stagnate opponents' turns as they don't want their permanent stolen, and can be recurred for multiple triggers. Continuing with artifacts, we have to talk about the namesake Birthing Pod and Whip of Erebos. Birthing Pod is the bread and butter of the whole strategy, as our deck is built completely around it. As previously mentioned, this card cares about incremental growth of CMC from our creature pool. We could just have a bunch of different creatures in the deck, with CMCs everywhere, but that wouldn't translate well with Pod. The best measure for this is to have a large pool of low-costed creatures and a small pool of high-costed creatures, as this is the most effective measure to ensure we find creatures when tutoring. Whip of Erebos synergizes with Pod and Self-Mill incredibly, as Pod wants to sacrifice a lot of creature and Self-Mill wants to fill our graveyard. With this, our selection for targets to whip back can be quite vast, and though they're only around for a turn before exile, we can reuse Pod to search for a body to replace them. Ultimately, these two pieces synergize incredibly well together, recycling our creatures and climbing in value until we overrun opponents. Though our creature pool takes up most of the bulk in the deck, that doesn't mean that we're running bad enchantments. On the flip side, we're going to be talking about Deadbridge Chant, Path of Discovery, and the Mending of Dominaria. Deadbridge Chant is a highly synergistic enchantment that self-mills us for 10 cards, and though this ability by itself is quite good for us, the second part is where we get some great value. At our upkeep, at random, we choose a card from our graveyard and put it back in our hand. This isn't card type specific either, meaning that we'll have a somewhat reliable way of not only getting our permanents back, but also our instants and sorceries. Path of Discovery, I would argue, is potentially one of the best enchantments in the deck. This card allows us to get some card advantage whenever a creature enters the battlefield through Explore. This allows us to reveal the top card of our library, and if it's a land, then it goes into our hand. If not, then we may either put the card back on top of our library or into our graveyard. With us being creature and graveyard focused, this is a perfect effect for us to have, as we can put key creatures into our graveyard or filter down until we have a draw that we can use. The one issue of this though is that we do have to reveal what we're playing with, allowing for opponents to be prepared, especially if we want the card back on top of our library. Lastly, the Mending of Dominaria, similar to Deadbridge Chant in some ways, helps our self-mill strategy, and also gets us creatures from our graveyard back to our hand. However, the ability we're mainly looking at is the last one. With this ability, we're able to play all lands that we've been milling from our graveyard to the battlefield, adding an explosive burst of acceleration to our game plan. This ability is ultimately best around mid to late game, as we are hoping to have many lands in our graveyard at these times to utilize. With us having great stomping power and creatures, we really have some game enders and value generation and sorceries in the form of Villainous Wealth, Rise of the Dark Realms, and Life from the Loam. Villainous Wealth allows for a great steal effect for one of our opponents, but instead of taking permanents from the battlefield, we will instead be taking them from the top of their deck. This could potentially be great, as some effects such as tutoring and scrying keep great value on top of decks. Should we be able to watch these lines of play, and when opponents are keeping their value on top, then we can take full advantage of Villainous Wealth and get that value for ourselves. Rise of the Dark Realms is an all-star to the format, and for good reason. By utilizing Self-Mill and Pod, we will get back all the creatures that we've been sending to the graveyard back to the battlefield. This isn't just our graveyard though, it also utilizes our opponent's graveyards. Meaning, should we cast this in the late game, we can recur massive threats that our opponents were trying to utilize earlier in the game. Lastly, Life from the Loam is a fantastic card for a few reasons. To start, the card carries Dredge 3, which greatly enables our self-mill strategy, with it milling us for 3 cards every time we opt to dredge instead of draw. Next, this card is a sorcery, allowing us to almost instantly put it into the graveyard from cast, which is good since we don't have to wait long for the dredge. Lastly, it lets us get 3 lands from our graveyard back to our hand. This is good as we will more than likely be milling a ton of lands from our strategy, which can be better utilized on the battlefield. Coming around to instants, we have Assassin's Trophy, Sultai Charm, and mentions of Stifle and Disallow. Assassin's Trophy is one of the best removal spells that we have in the deck, with it essentially acting as our form of Anguish Unmaking. The difference though is that we may take to destroying a land as well, which can be quite important. The only downside to this card is that the opponent may go look for a basic land that will come to the battlefield untapped. However, this trade-off will be more than worth it, as we would much rather see a land than a huge threat. Sultai Charm is in the deck for its flexibility. We have 3 different options to choose from, with 2 of them primarily focused on removal. The artifact and enchantment removal of the card is always a pleasant sight. The removal for a mono-colored creature is also quite good, though it is limited. Finally, the last ability helps with filling our hand and graveyard, and with it being at instant speed, could help us to find some answers if needed. Though Stifle and Disallow are just some counterspells, we will need these spells as we need to catch the triggered and activated abilities of some cards. With us running Self-Mill, cards like Bojuka Bog and Tormod's Crypt completely blow us out of the water, and we will need to stop them if possible. Stifle is just the simplistic version of this, but Disallow gives us some flexibility as we will have the option to counter any spell. These cards will sometimes be dead, but so long as our strategy is safe, then we can find other uses for these cards. Their importance is narrow, but completely necessary for the sustainability of our strategies. For lands, we could be a bit flexible and talk about cards like Takenuma, Abandoned Mire, Demolition Field, and Emergence Zone. Takenuma, Abandoned Mire holds an effect that we're really looking to take advantage of. With its channel ability, we're able to mill 3 cards and select a creature to bring back to our hand. This really helps to pump our strategy a lot quicker, and with the recursion effects, can be done multiple times if in a pinch. Demolition Field is one of the options we carry for land disruption. This card allows us to destroy any non-basic while letting us and our opponent search for a basic land. This is quite an important effect, as if we can take key non-basic lands, it can easily slow our opponents down should they be relying on these types of cards for their strategies. Emergence Zone, though a bit different from the other lands, plays a key role to our strategy. One of the biggest problems the deck can run into is having to play at sorcery speed, but with this land and a few other options, we have the chance to play at instant speed for any of our non-land cards. This is especially strong as we have incredible ETB effects on most of our creatures and other cards. The biggest aspect of all these cards is that they may be recurred, allowing for repeatable and reliable effects that will hopefully net us a lot of value throughout a game. Unfortunately, we will not be playing any planeswalkers or battles in this deck. We are a bit too creature focused to think about putting these types of cards in, as they may work to slow us down rather than help us out. When building this deck, I didn't restrain myself to a budget, as I thought it would be a great deck to try and see how far it can go. If playing on a budget, you may want to stop here and look over the list to see if there are any replacements that can be made to help you. However, if not constrained by financials, let's talk about a few upgrades. One of the most notable to think of is possibly Craterhoof Behemoth, as we are looking to have some great game-ending slots when podding for high CMC creatures. Some tutors could also be mentioned, as the sooner we can find pod or whip, the faster and better our strategy will become. Rhystic Study could also make an appearance, as we're trying to find the components to our strategy, as it can also be recurred with many of the cards in the deck. Really, upgrades are player dependent, and you are free to make your own choices about what might make a slot better. To add a bit of a newer section, we can talk about commanders that have the potential to replace Tasigur in the command zone. The first to talk about is obviously Sidisi Brood Tyrant. Sidisi has been shown to work in the past with this type of deck in a bygone standard, and could more than likely work here. The only issue of concern is that Sidisi herself has no means of recursion on her, meaning that getting key cards we need out of our graveyard is going to be much harder to accomplish. The trade-off though is that we will more than likely have a better board state to work with, as we will be pumping out 2/2 tokens for us. Another commander to look towards is Muldrotha of the Gravetide. The commander seems perfect for the deck, as it allows us to replay one of every type of permanent from our graveyard every turn. This by itself can be an incredible function, as we want as much recursion as possible. However, there is one issue that needs to be addressed. Muldrotha can receive a lot of hate from our opponents, and if we can't find a reliable means of recursion, then we are stuck with paying an ever-increasing commander tax. With time, it will come to a point where we're using every available resource to get Muldrotha back to the field, which can really hinder our value engine. Though Tasigur is not perfect, he fits as a nice in-between. He's a decent body that offers a form of recursion and some self-mill. Should Tasigur start receiving hate, he has the great utility of having Delve, which we can always use to make getting him out all the easier. These are the reasons why Tasigur sits in the command zone, but should you think there's a better option, go ahead and make the swap. Life and death hold a delicate balance, and the mixture of the two could be a recycling force, that no matter how hard you try to get rid of one, the other side will always come to assist the other. For life begets death, and death makes way for life. I sat with the idea of this deck for a few years, and I'm glad I can finally get the chance to finish it and be happy with it. Though a bit on the pricier end of decks that I'm usually comfortable talking about, it can easily be mixed around to find a budget. I simply made this deck to the exact specifications that I would be happy with. Power level wise, I would place this deck probably around a 7. I like this ranking as we have many strategies that synergize with each other and can be quite effective. However, we need some time to set up, especially with self-mill being one of our main strategies. If this deck is something you might be interested in, I will have a link for it in the description. With that being said, I would like to thank you for watching, and if this is a piece of content that you enjoyed watching, I would recommend pressing subscribe to keep up with the content I'm making. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.